Alright. Blogging time. And I'll be honest, I think my earlier venture out into the cold was did something to my brain, cause when I took off my wet clothing, I put some of it right on top of the fucking book. So now, like, a substantial part of these pages are like kind of like warped because they're wet, you know? It's got all these warpings now. It's kind like the text is so readable. It's perfectly readable, but you know, me and my OCD are a bit disturbed by my recent inadequacies. Okay, let's continue forward with reading. Next chapter is The Map and the Parachute. And here is just a single quote. Oedipus, what is the rite of purification? How shall it be done? And Creon, by banishing a man, or expiation of blood by blood. And that is Sophocles, Oedipus the King. I read that before. That was from school. In fact, I think I have a copy of it. No. I was about to say Oedipus Rex, but we read Oedipus Tyrannus, right? Right? Is that the same thing? Maybe. Probably. Oh well. Alright, let's do this shit. William Peters was trying to convince himself, using a strict randomized trial, that megadose chemotherapy worked, but others were already convinced. Many oncologists had long assumed that the regimen was so obviously effective that no trial could possibly be needed. After all, the deepest reservoirs of the marrow could be depleted by the searing doses of drugs. After all, if the deepest reservoirs of the marrow could be depleted by the searing dose of drugs, how could cancer possibly resist? By the late 1980s, hospitals and increasingly private clinics offering marrow transplantation for breast cancer had sprouted up all over America, Great Britain, and France, with waiting lists that stretched into several hundreds of women. Among the most prominent and successful of the megadose transplanters was Werner Bezwoda, an oncologist in the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, which was recruiting dozens of women into his trial every month. Transplant was big business, big medicine, big money, big infrastructure, and big risks. At large academic centers like the Beth Israel Hospital in Boston, entire floors were refitted into transplantation units, with case volumes that ran into several dozen each week. Minimizing the risks of the procedure using creative phrasing became a cottage industry. As private clinics lined up to perform transplants on women, they christened the procedure a mini-transplant, or transplant light, or even drive-through transplant. Transplanters, as one oncologist put it, became gods at hospitals. This frantic landscape was tipped into further disarray as patients began to file requests for insurance providers to pay for the procedure, priced anywhere between $50,000 to $40,000. $50,000 to $400,000 per patient. In the summer of 1991, a public school teacher named Nelene Fox in Temecula, California, was diagnosed with advanced breast cancer. Fox was 38 years old, the mother of 3 children, when she relapsed with metastatic breast cancer after exhausting all conventional therapies. The doctor suggested an autologous bone marrow transplant as a last resort. Fox lunged at the suggestion, but when she applied to HealthNet, her insurance provider, to pay for the transplant, HealthNet refused, stating that the procedure was still investigational and thus not covered by the HMO standard list of clinically proven protocols. In another decade, and with any other disease, Fox's case may have garnered scarcely any public attention, but something fundamental about the relationship between patients and medicine had changed in the aftermath of AIDS. Until the late 1980s, an experimental drug or procedure had been considered precisely that, experimental, and thus unavailable unavailable for general public use. But AIDS activism had transformed the idea. Um, had transformed the idea. An investigational agent, AIDS activists insisted, was no longer a hothouse flower meant to be cultivated only in the rarefied greenhouses of academic medicine, but rather a public resource merely waiting in the warming antechamber of science, while doctors finished clinical trials that would, in the end, prove the efficacy of said drugs or procedures anyway. Patients, in short, had lost patience. Ha 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 ha. They did not want trials, they wanted drugs and cures. Act Up, parading on the streets of New York and Washington, had made the FDA out to be a wholly bureaucratic godfather. A woolly bureaucratic godfather, exhausting but maddeningly slow, whose sole purpose was to delay access to critical medicines. HealthNet's denial of Nalene Fox's transplant thus generated a visceral public reaction. Furious and desperate, Fox decided to raise the money privately by writing thousands of letters. By mid-April 1992, an enormous fundraising effort to pay for Fox's transplant had swung into gear. Temecula, a quiet hamlet of golf courses and antique shops, was gripped by a mission. Money poured in from softball matches and pie sales, from lemonade stands and car washes, from local Sizzler restaurant, from a yogurt shop that donated a portion of its profits. On June 19th, a retinue of Fox's supporters chanting "Transplant, Transplant" and Fox's name staged a rally outside HealthNet's corporate headquarters. A few days later, Fox's brother, an attorney named Mark Heipler, filed a lawsuit against HealthNet to force the HMO to pay for his sister's transplant. "You marketed this coverage to her when she was well," Heipler wrote. "Please provide it now that she is ill." In the late summer of 1992, when HealthNet refused yet another request for coverage, once again citing lack of clinical evidence, Fox chose to go ahead on her own. By then, she had raised $220,000 from nearly 2,500 friends, neighbors, relatives, co-workers, and strangers, enough to afford the transplant on her own. On August 1992, Nalene Fox thus underwent high-dose chemotherapy and a bone marrow transplant for metastatic breast cancer, hoping for a new lease on her life. And there's our break, but we'll keep going. In the gleaming new wards of the Norris Center in Los Angeles, where Fox was undergoing her transplant, the story of Werner Bezwoda's remarkable success with megadose chemotherapy was already big news. In Bezwoda's hands, everything about the regimen seemed to work like a perfectly cast spell. A stocky, intense, solitary man capable, Oz-like, of inspiring both charm and suspicion. Bezwoda was the South-styled wizard of autologous transplantation who presided over an ever-growing clinical empire in Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, with patients flying in from Europe, Asia, and Africa. As Bezwoda's case series swelled, so too did his reputation. By the mid-1990s, he was regularly jetting up from South Africa to discuss his experience with megadose chemotherapy at meetings and conferences organized all around the world. The dose-limiting barrier, Bezwoda announced audaciously in 1992, had been overcome, instantly rocketing himself and his clinic into stratospheric fame. Oncologists, scientists, and patients who thronged to his packed seminars found themselves mesmerized by his results. Bezwoda lectured slowly and dispassionately, in a bone-dry, deadpan drone, looking occasionally at the screen with his characteristic sideways glance, delivering the most exhilarating observations in the world of clinical oncology as if reading the Soviet evening news. At times, the ponderous style seemed almost deliberately mismatched, for even Bezwoda knew that his results were outstanding. As the lights flickered on for the poster session at the annual oncology meeting held at San Diego in May 1992, clinicians flocked around him, flooding him with questions and congratulations. In Johannesburg, more than 90% of women treated with the megadose regimen had achieved a complete response, a rate that even the powerhouse academic centers in the U.S. had been unable to achieve. Bezwoda, it seemed, was going to lead oncology out of its decades-long impasse with cancer. Nalene Fox, though, was not so fortunate. She soldiered through the punishing regimen of high-dose chemotherapy and the multiple complications. But less than 1 year after her transplant, breast cancer relapsed explosively all over her body, in her lungs, liver, lymph nodes, and most important, in her brain. On April 22nd, 11 months after Bezwoda's poster was hung up in nearby San Diego, Fox passed away in her home in a shaded cul-de-sac in Temecula. She was only 40 years old. She left behind a husband and 3 daughters, aged 4, 9, and 11, and a lawsuit against HealthNet, now winding its way through the California court system. Juxtaposed against Bezwoda's phenomenal results, Fox's agonizing struggle and untimely death seemed a more egregious outcome. Convinced that the delayed transplant, not cancer, had hastened his sister's demise, Heeper broadened his claims against HealthNet and vigorously pushed for a court trial. The crux of Heeper's case rested on the definition of the word investigational. High-dose chemotherapy could, he argued, hardly be considered an investigational procedure if nearly every major clinical center in the nation was offering it to patients, both on and off trial. In 1993 alone, 1,177 papers in medical journals had been written on this subject. In certain hospitals, entire wards were dedicated to the procedure. The label experimental was slapped on, Heeper contended, by HMOs to save money by denying coverage. If all you have is a cold or the flu, sure, they will take good care of you. But when you get breast cancer, what happens? Out comes investigative, out comes experimental. On the morning of December 28, 1983, Mark Heeper spent nearly 2 hours in the courtroom describing the devastating last year of his sister's life. The balconies and benches overflowed with Fox's friends and supporters, and with patients, many of them weeping with anger and empathy. The jury took less than 2 hours to deliberate. That evening, it returned a verdict awarding Fox's family $89 million in damages, the second highest amount in the history of litigation in California and one of the highest ever awarded in a medical case in America. $89 million was largely symbolic. The case was eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed smaller amount, but it was also the kind of symbolism that any HMO could readily understand. In 1993, patient advocacy groups urged women to battle similar cases around the country. Understandably, most insurers began to relent. In Massachusetts, Charlotte Turner, a 47-year-old nurse diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer, lobbied ferociously for her transplant, rushing on a wheelchair from one legislator's office to another with sheets of medical articles in her arms. In late 1993, as a result of Turner's efforts, the Massachusetts state legislature enacted the so-called Charlotte's Law, mandating coverage for transplantation for eligible patients within the state. By the mid-1990s, 7 states required HMOs to pay for bone marrow transplantation, with similar legislation pending in 7 additional states. Between 1988 and 2002, 86 cases were filed by patients against HMOs that had denied transplants. In 47 instances, the patient won the case. That this turn of events, aggressive chemotherapy and marrow transplantation mandated by law, was truly extraordinary was not lost on many observers. It was, at face value, a liberating moment for many patients and patient advocates, but medical journals ran rife with scorching critiques of the protocol. It is a complicated, costly, and potentially dangerous technology, one article complained pointedly. The litany of complications were grim: infections, hemorrhage, blood clots in the arteries and the liver, heart failure, scarring of lungs, the skin, kidneys, and tendons. Infertility was often permanent. Patients were confined to the hospital for weeks, and, most ominous perhaps, between 5 and 10% of women ran the risk of developing a second cancer or precancerous lesion as a result of the treatment itself. Cancer is doggedly recalcitrant to any therapy. But as autologous transplantation for cancer exploded into a major enterprise, the scientific evaluation of the protocol fell further and further behind. Indeed, the trials were caught up in an old and perverse quagmire. Everyone, patients, doctors, HMOs, advocacy groups, wanted trials in principle, but no one wanted to be in trials in practice. The more health insurance plans opened their floodgates for bone marrow transplantations, the more women fled from clinical trials, fearing that they might be assigned to the non-treatment arm by what amounted to a coin flip. Between 1991 and 1999, roughly 40,000 women around the world underwent marrow transplantation for breast cancer at an estimated cost of between $2 billion and $4 billion. At the higher estimate, about twice the yearly budget of the NCI. Merely patient accrual for the clinical trials, including Peter's trial at Duke, nearly trickled to a halt. The disjunction was poignant. Even as clinics overflowed with women being treated with high-dose chemotherapy and wards filled the beds with transplanted patients, the seminal measure to test the efficacy of that regimen was pushed aside, almost as if it were an afterthought. Transplants everywhere, as Robert Meyer put it, but not a patient to test. And that's our second break. Is this the right chapter? It is, I think. Yeah. Okay, good. Because this is the last chapter before part 5. That's cool. Okay. When Bezwoda returned to the annual cancer meeting in Atlanta in May 1999, he was clearly triumphant. He rose to the podium confidently, feigning irritation that his name had been mispronounced during the introduction, and flashed his opening slides. As Bezwoda presented the data, his monotone voice washing over the vast sea of faces in front of him, a spell of silence fell over the audience. The Wizard of Wits had worked magic again. At Witwatersrand Rand Hospital, young women with high-risk breast cancer treated with bone marrow transplants had shown staggeringly successful results. At 8.5 years, nearly 60% of patients in the megadose transplant arm were still alive, versus only 20% in the control arm. For patients treated with the Bezwoda regimen, the line of survival had plateaued at about 7 years with no further deaths, suggesting that many of the remaining patients were not just alive, but likely cured. Applause broke out among transplanters. But Bezwoda's triumph felt odd, for although the Witwatersrand results were unequivocally spectacular, 3 other trials presented that afternoon, including Peters, were either equivocal or negative. At Duke, embarrassingly enough, the trial had not even been finished because of low accrual, and while it was too soon to assess the survival benefits of transplantation, its darker face was readily evident. Of the 300-odd patients randomized to the transplant arm, 31 women had died of complications, of infections, blood clots, failed organs, and leukemias. The news from Philadelphia was even more grim. The megadose chemotherapy regimen had not produced a hint of benefit, not even a modest improvement, as the investigators glumly informed the audience. A complex and tangled trial from Sweden, with patients divided into groups and subgroups, was also headed inexorably towards failure with no obvious survival benefit in sight. How then to reconcile these vastly disparate results? The president of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, or ASCO, had asked a panel of discussants to try to hammer all the contradictory data into a single cohesive shape, but even the experts threw up their hands. My goal here, one discussant began, frankly befuddled, is to critique the data just presented, to maintain some credibility in the field, and to continue to remain friends with both the presenters and the discussants. But even that would be a tall order. On and off the stage, the presenters and discussants bickered about small points, having critiques at each other's trials. Nothing was resolved, and certainly no friendships were made. People who like to transplant will continue to transplant, and people who don't will continue not to. Larry Norton, the powerful breast oncologist and president of the National Alliance for Breast Cancer organization, told a journalist for the New York Times. The conference had been a disaster. As the exhausted audience trickled out of the massive auditorium in Atlanta, it was already dark outside, and the warm, muggy blast of air provided no relief. There's another break, but we'll keep going. Bezvoda left the Atlantic meeting in a hurry, leaving behind a field awash with confusion and tumult. He had underestimated the impact of his data, for it was now the sole fulcrum on which an entire theory of cancer therapy, not to mention a $4 billion industry, rested. Oncologists had come to Atlanta for clarity. They left exasperated and confused. In December 1999, with the benefits of the regimen still uncertain and thousands of women clamoring for treatment, a team of American investigators wrote to Bezvoda at Witwatersrand to ask if they could travel to Johannesburg to examine the data for his trial in person. Bezvoda's transplants were the only ones that had succeeded. Perhaps important lessons could be learned and brought back to America. Bezvoda readily agreed. On the first day of the visit, when the investigators requested the records and logbooks of the 154 patients in this study, Bezvoda sent them only 58 files, all, oddly, from the treatment arm of the trial. When the team pressed for records from the control arm, Bezvoda claimed that they had been lost. Mystified, the team probed further, and the pictures began to turn disturbing. The records provided were remarkably shoddy, scratched out, one-page notes with random scribbles written almost as an afterthought, summarizing 6 or 8 months of supposed care. Criteria for eligibility for the trial were virtually always missing in the records. Bezvoda had claimed to have transplanted equal numbers. Bezvoda had claimed to transplanted equal numbers of black and white women, yet nearly all the records belonged to poor, barely literate black women treated at the Hillbrow Hospital in Johannesburg. When the researchers asked for consent forms for a procedure known to have deadly consequences, no such forms could be found. The hospital's review boards, meant to safeguard such proposals, certainly had no copies. No one, it seemed, had approved the procedure or possessed even the barest knowledge of the trial. Many of the patients counted as alive had long been discharged to terminal care facilities with advanced, fungating lesions of breast cancer, presumably to die, with no designated follow-up. One woman counted in the treatment arm had never been treated with any drugs. Another patient record, tracking back to its origin, belonged to a man, not a patient with breast cancer. The whole thing was a fraud, an invention, a sham. In late February 2000, with the trial unraveling and the noose of the investigation tightening around him every day, Werner Bezvoda wrote a terse typewritten letter to his colleagues at Witwatersrand admitting to have falsified parts of the study. He would later claim that he had altered his records to make the trial more accessible to American researchers. I have committed a serious breach of scientific honesty and integrity, he wrote. He then resigned from his university position and promptly stopped giving interviews, referring all questions to his attorney. His phone number was unlisted in Johannesburg. In 2008, when I tried to reach him for an interview, Werner Bezwoda was nowhere to be found. Dang, what a turn of events. And that's another break. Man, break after break after break. How many pages? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 4.5. The epic fall of Werner Bezwoda was a terminal blow to the ambitions of megadose chemotherapy. In December of 1999, a final trial was designed to examine whether STAMP might increase survival among women with breast cancer that had spread to multiple lymph nodes. 4 years later, the answer was clear. There was no discernible benefit. Of the 500 patients assigned to the high-dose group, 9 died of transplantation-related complications. An additional 9 developed highly aggressive chemotherapy-resistant acute myeloid leukemias as a consequence of their treatments, cancers far worse than the cancers that they had begun with. By the late 1990s, the romance was already over, Robert Myers said. The final trials were merely trials meant to hammer the nails into the coffin. We had suspected that result for nearly a decade. Maggie Keswick Jenks witnessed the end of the transplant era in 1995. Jenks, a landscape artist who lived in Scotland, created fantastical and desolate gardens, futuristic swirls of sticks, lakes, stones, and earth, shored up amongst the disordered forces of nature. Diagnosed with breast cancer in 1988, she was treated with a lumpectomy and then a mastectomy. For several months, she considered herself cured, but 5 years later, just short of her 52nd birthday, she relapsed with metastatic breast cancer in her liver, bones, and spine. At the Western General Hospital in Edinburgh, she was treated with high-dose chemotherapy followed by autologous transplant. Jenks did not know that the STAMP trial would eventually fail. Dr. Bill Peters had already treated several hundred patients with transplantation, she wrote, ever hopeful for a cure. The average length of remission for his patients after treatment was 18 months. It seemed like a lifetime. But Jenks' remission did not last a lifetime. In 1994, just short of her 18th month after transplantation, she relapsed again. She died in July 1995. That is 18 months. It was like a lifetime. Oh, it did not last a lifetime. Well, I don't know. In an essay titled "A View from the Frontline," Jenks described her experience with cancer as like being woken up mid-flight on a jumbo jet and then thrown out with a parachute into a foreign landscape without a map. There you are, the future patient, quietly progressing with other passengers towards a distant destination when, astonishingly, why me, a large hole opens in the floor next to you. People in white coats appear, help you into a parachute, and, no time to think, out you go. You descend, you hit the ground, but where's the enemy? What is the enemy? What is it up to? No road, no compass, no map, no training. Is there anything you should know and don't? The white coats are far, far away, strapping others into their parachutes. Occasionally they wave, but even if you ask them, they don't know the answers. They are up there in the jumbo, involved with parachutes, not map-making. The image captured the desolation and desperation of the era. Obsessed with radical and aggressive therapies, oncologists were devising newer and newer parachutes, but with no systemic maps of the quagmire to guide patients and doctors. The war on cancer was lost, in both senses of the word. That's very cool. Like lost as in directional versus lost as in defeated. That's very cool. Okay. We're almost there to the end of the chapter. I want to read one more chapter after this, though. Let's do this thing. Whoa, sexy. What time is it? 30 minutes already. Oh, I should do my Duolingo. Yeah, okay. Alright. Summer is a season of sequels, but no one, frankly, was looking forward to John Baylor's. Sequestered away at the University of Chicago, Baylor had been smoldering quietly in his office since his first article, Progress Against Cancer, had sent a deep gash through the NCI's brow in May 1986. 洗手间洗手间 But 11 years had passed since the publication of that article, and Baylor, the nation's reminder-in-chief on cancer, was expected to explode with an update any day. In May 1987, exactly 11 years after the publication of his first article, Baylor was back in the pages of the New England Journal of Medicine with another appraisal of the progress on cancer. The punchline of Baylor's article, co-authored with an epidemiologist named Heather Gornick, was evident in its title, Cancer Undefeated. In 1986, he began pointedly, when one of us reported on trends in the incidence of cancer in the United States from 1950 to 1982, it was clear that some 40 years of cancer research, centered primarily on treatment, had failed to reverse a long, slow increase in mortality. Here we update that analysis through 1994. Our evaluation begins with 1970. Both two provide some overlap with the previous article, and because passage of the National Cancer Act of 1971 marked a critical increase in the magnitude and vigor of the nation's efforts in cancer research. Fucking ads, dude. I fucking hate ads.
Hey, you. What's it?
Shut the fuck up, bitch. Okay. That's gonna be it. Alright, good. Now we can focus. Little had changed the methodology from Baylor's early analysis. As before, Baylor and Gornick began by age-adjusting the United States population, such that every year between 1970 and 1994 contained exactly the same distribution of ages. The method is described in more detail in earlier pages. Cancer mortality of each age bracket was also adjusted proportionally, in effect, creating a frozen static population so that cancer mortality could be compared directly from one year to the next. The pattern that emerged from this analysis was sobering. Between 1970 and 1994, cancer mortality had, if anything, increased slightly, from about 6%, from 189 deaths per 100,000 to 201 deaths. Admittedly, the death rate had plateaued somewhat in the last 10 years, but even so, this could hardly be construed as a victory. Cancer, Baylor concluded, was still reigning undefeated. Charted as a graph, the nation's progress on cancer was a flat line. The war on cancer had, thus far, yielded a stalemate. But was the flatline of cancer mortality truly inanimate? Physics teaches us to discriminate a static equilibrium from a dynamic equilibrium. The product of two equal and opposite reactions can seem to sit perfectly still until the opposing forces are uncoupled. What if the flat line of cancer mortality represented the dynamic equilibrium of counterbalanced forces pushing and pulling against each other? As Baylor and Gornick probed their data further, they began to discern such forces counterpoised against each other with almost exquisite precision. When cancer mortality between 1970 and 1994 was split into two age groups, the counterbalancing of forces was immediately obvious. In men and women above 55, cancer mortality had increased, while in men and women under 55, cancer mortality had decreased by exactly the same proportion. A similar dynamic equilibrium was apparent when cancer mortality was reassessed by the type of cancer involved. Mortality had decreased for some forms, plateaued for others, and increased for yet others, offsetting nearly every gain with the equal and opposite loss. Death rates from colon cancer, for instance, had fallen nearly 30%, and from cervical and uterine cancer by 20%. Both diseases could be detected by screening tests, colonoscopies, and pap smears, and at least part of the decrease in mortality was a likely consequence of earlier detection. I'm gonna move you, because I know darkness is not really something that you like to see for Shibal. Slightly better, sure. At least I'm closer to the light now. Death rates for most forms of children's cancer had also declined since the 1970s, with declines continuing over the decade. So too had mortality from Hodgkin's disease and testicular cancer. Although the net number of such cancers still represented a small fraction of the total cancer mortality, treatment had fundamentally altered the physiognomy of these diseases. The most prevalent countervailing balance against these advances was lung cancer. Lung cancer was still the single biggest killer among cancers, responsible for nearly 1/4 of all cancer deaths. Overall mortality for lung cancer had increased between 1970 and 1994, but the distribution of deaths was markedly skewed. Death rates among men had peaked and dropped off by the mid-1980s. In contrast, lung cancer mortality had dramatically risen in women, particularly older women, and it was still rising. Between 1970 and 1994, lung cancer deaths among women over the age of 55 had increased by 400%, more than the rise in the rates of breast and colon cancer combined. This exponential upswing in mortality had effaced nearly all gains in survival, not just for lung cancer, but all other types of cancer. Alterations in the pattern of lung cancer mortality had also partially explained the overall age skew of cancer mortality. The incidence in lung cancer was highest in those above 55 and lower in men and women below 45, a consequence of changes in smoking behavior since the 1950s. The decrease in cancer mortality in younger men and women had been perfectly offset by the increase in cancer mortality in older women and women. Taken in balance, Cancer Undefeated was an article whose title belied its message. The national stalemate on cancer was hardly a stalemate, but rather the product of a frantic game of death in progress. Baylor had set out to prove that the war on cancer had reached terminal stagnancy. Instead, he had chronicled a dynamic, moving battle in mid-pitch against a dynamic, moving target. So even Baylor, especially Baylor, the fiercest and most inventive critic of the war, could not deny the fierce inventiveness of this war. Pressed on public television, he begrudgingly conceded the point. And here's a little back and forth. Interviewer: why do you think they're going down a little bit, or plateauing? Baylor: we think they have gone down perhaps 1%. I would like to wait a little longer to see this downturn confirmed, but if it isn't here yet, it's coming. Interviewer: Dr. Baylor? Baylor: I think we might agree that the cup is half full, so he's quite optimistic. And that's our last break, but we only have, half a page left? No single strategy for prevention or cure had been a runaway success, But undeniably, this half-full cup was the product of an astonishingly ingenious array of forces that had been deployed against cancer. The vaulted promises of the 1960s and 70s and the struggles of the 1980s had given way to a more grounded realism in the 1990s, but this new reality had brought its own promises. Sharply critiquing the defeatism of Baylor and Gornick's assessment, Richard Klausner, the director of the NCI, pointed out, cancer is, in truth, a variety of diseases. Viewing it as a single disease that will yield to a single approach is no more logical than viewing neuropsychiatric disease as a single entity that will respond to one strategy. It is unlikely that we will soon see a magic bullet for the treatment of cancer, but it is just as unlikely that there will be a magic bullet for prevention or early detection that will knock out the full spectrum of cancers. We are making progress. Although we also have a long way to go, it is facile to claim that the pace of favorable trends in mortality reflects poor policies or mistaken priorities. An era of oncology was coming to a close. Already the field had turned away from its fiery adolescence, its entrancement with universal solutions and radical cures, and was grappling with fundamental questions about cancer. What were the underlying principles that governed the root behavior of a particular form of cancer? What was common to all cancers, and what made breast cancer different from lung or prostate cancer? Might these common pathways, or differences for that matter, establish new roadmaps to cure and prevent cancer? The quest to combat cancer thus turned inwards, towards basic biology, towards fundamental mechanisms. To answer these questions, we must turn inwards too. We must at last return to the cancer cell. And that is it for this chapter and for part 4. We go to part 5. Part 5. A distorted version of our normal selves. We have 3 quotes. It is in vain to speak of cures or think of remedies until such time as we have considered of the causes. Cures must be imperfect, lame, and to no purpose, wherein the causes have not first been searched. And that is from Robert Burton in The Anatomy of Melancholy of 1893. That's very early. You can't do experiments to see what causes cancer. It's not an accessible problem, and it's not the sort of thing scientists can even afford to do. And that is from I. Herman, cancer researcher in 1978. And finally, what can be the why of these happenings? And that is from Peyton Bruce, 1966, on the mystery of the origin of cancer. A unitary cause is the first chapter. It is the spring of 2005. Of a pivot point. Oh my god, there's no quotes here. Cool. It is the spring of 2005, a pivot point in medical oncology fellowship. Our paths are about to divide. 3 of us will continue in the clinic, with the primary focus in clinical research and in the day-to-day care of patients. 4 will explore cancer in the laboratory, retaining just a minor presence in the clinic, seeing just a handful of patients each week. The choice between the 2 paths is instinctual. Some of us inherently perceive ourselves as clinicians, others primarily as scientists. My own inclinations have changed little since the first day of my internship. Clinical medicine moves me viscerally, but I am a lab rat, a nocturnal, peripatetic creature drawn to the basic biology of cancer. I mull over the type of cancer to study in the laboratory, and I find myself gravitating towards leukemia. I may be choosing the laboratory, but my subject of research is governed by a patient. Carla's disease has left its mark on my life. Even so, in the fading twilight of my full-time immersion in the hospital, there are disquieting moments that remind me of how deeply clinical medicine can surprise and engage me. It is late one evening in the fellow's room, and the hospital around it has fallen silent, save for the metallic clink of cutlery being brought up for meals. The air outside is heavy with impending rain. The 7 of us, close friends by now, are compiling lists of patients to pass on to the next class of fellows when Lauren begins to read her list aloud, calling out the names of those in her care who have died out over our 2-year fellowship. Suddenly inspired, she pauses and adds a sentence to each name as a sort of epitaph. It is an impromptu memorial service, and it stirs something in the room. I joined in, calling out names of my patients who have died and appending a sentence or two in memory. God, how long is this? Oh, it's just 2. Okay. Kenneth Armour, 62, an internist with stomach cancer. In his final days, all he wished for was a vacation with his wife and time to play with his cats. Oscar Fisher, 38, had small cell lung cancer. Cognitively impaired since birth, he was his mother's favorite child. When he died, she was threading rosaries through his fingers. That night, I sit alone with my list, remembering the names and faces late into the evening. How does one memorialize a patient? These men and women have been my friends, my interlocutors, my teachers, a surrogate family. I stand up at my desk as if at a funeral, my ears hot with emotion, my eyes full of tears. I look around the room at the empty desks and note how swiftly the last 2 years have reshaped all 7 of us. Eric, cocksure, ambition and smart, is humbler and more introspective. Edwin, preternaturally cheerful and optimistic in his first month, talks openly about resignation and grief. Rick, an organic chemist by training, has become so infatuated with clinical medicine that he doubts that he will ever return to the laboratory. Lauren, guarded and mature, enlivens her astute assessments with jokes about oncology. Our encounter with cancer has rounded us off. It is smooth and polished dust like river rocks. River rocks. River rocks. River rocks. River rocks. River rocks. That was our break. Let's keep going. A few days later, I meet Carla in the infusion room. She is casually chatting with the nurses, as if catching up with old friends. From a distance, she is barely recognizable. The sheet-white complexion I recall from her first visit to the hospital has warmed up several degrees of red. The bruises on her arm from repeated infusions have vanished. Her children are back in the routine. Her husband has returned to work. Her mother is home in Florida. Carla's life is nearly normal. She tells me that her daughter occasionally wakes up crying from a nightmare. When I ask her if this reflects some remnant trauma from Carla's year-long ordeal with illness, she shakes her head assertively. No, it's just monsters in the dark. It has been little more than a year since her original diagnosis. She is still taking pills of 6-mercaptopurine and methotrexate, Birkenau's drug and Farber's drug, a combination intended to block the growth of any remnant cancer cells. When she recalls the lowest points of her illness, she shudders in disgust. But something is normalizing and healing inside her. Her own monsters are vanishing, like old bruises. When her blood counts return from the lab, they are stone-cold normal. Her remission continues. I am astonished and exhausted by the news, but I bring it to her cautiously, as neutrally as I can. Like all patients, Carla smells over-enthusiasm with deep suspicion. A doctor who raves disproportionately about small victories is the same doctor who might be preparing his patient for some ultimate defeat. But this time there is no reason to be suspicious. I tell her her counts look perfect, and that no more tests are required today. In leukemia, she knows, no news is the best kind of news. And yeah, that was another break, but let's keep going. Later that evening, having finished my notes, I returned to the laboratory. It is a beehive of activity. Postdocs and graduate students hover around the microscopes and centrifuges. Medical words and phrases are occasionally recognizable here, but the dialect of the lab bears little resemblance to the dialect of medicine. It is like traveling to a neighboring country. It's like traveling to a neighboring country. It is like traveling to a neighboring country, one that has similar mannerisms but speaks a different language. And here's some quotes. But the PCR on the leukemia cells should pick up the band. What conditions did you use to run this gel? Agarose 4%. Was the RNA degraded in the centrifugation step? And back to normal. I retrieve a plate of cells from the incubator. The plate has 384 tiny wells, each barely large enough to hold 2 grains of rice. In each well, I have placed 200 human leukemia cells, then added a unique chemical from a large collection of untested chemicals. In parallel, I have its twin plate, containing 200 normal human blood-forming stem cells, with the same panel of chemicals added to each cell. Several times each day, an automated microscopic camera will photograph each well into 2 plates, and a computerized program will calculate the number of leukemia cells and normal stem cells. The experiment is seeking a chemical that can kill leukemia cells, but spare normal stem cells. A specifically targeted therapy against leukemia. I aspirate a few microliters containing the leukemia cells from one well and look at them under the microscope. The cells look bloated and grotesque, with a dilated nucleus and a thin rim of cytoplasm. The sign of a cell whose very soul has been co-opted to divide and to keep dividing with pathological monomaniacal purpose. These leukemia cells have come into my laboratory from the NCI, where they were grown and studied for nearly 3 decades. That these cells are still growing with obscene fecundity is a testament to the terrifying power of the disease. The cells, technically speaking, are immortal. The woman from whose body they were taken has been dead for 30 years. Whew. Alright, that was another break. How many pages? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Fuck. Let's go. As early as 1858, Virchow recognized the power of proliferation. Looking at cancer specimens under the microscope, Virchow understood that cancer was cellular hyperplasia, the disturbed pathological growth of cells. But although Virchow recognized and described the core abnormality, he could not fathom its cause. He argued that inflammation, the body's reaction to a harmful industry characterized by redness, swelling, and immune system activation, caused cells to proliferate, leading to the outgrowth of malignant cells. He was almost right. Chronic inflammation, smoldering over decades, does cause cancer. But Virchow missed the essence of the cause. Inflammation makes cells divide in response to injury. But the cell division is driven as a reaction to an external agent such as a bacteria or a wound. In cancer, the cell acquires autonomous proliferation. It is driven to divide by an internal signal. Virchow attributed the cancer to the disturbed physiological milieu around the cell. He failed to fathom that the true disturbance lay within the cancer cell itself. A few hundred miles south of Virchow's Berlin laboratory, Walter Fleming, a biologist working in Prague, tried to uncover the cause of abnormal cell division, although using salamander eggs rather than human cells as a subject. To understand cell division, Fleming had to visualize the inner anatomy of the cell. In 1879, Fleming thus stained dividing salamander cells with aniline, the all-purpose chemical dye used by Paul Ehrlich. The stain highlighted the blue thread-like substance located deep within the cell's nucleus that condensed and brightened to a cerulean shade just before cell division. Fleming called the blue stained structures chromosomes, colored bodies. He realized that cells from every species had a distinct number of chromosomes. Humans have 46, salamanders have 14. Chromosomes were duplicated during cell division and divided equally between the two daughter cells, thus keeping the chromosome number constant from generation to generation of cell division. But Fleming could not assign any further function to these mysterious blue colored bodies in the cell. Had Fleming moved his lens from salamander eggs to Virchow's human specimens, he might have made the next crucial conceptual leap in understanding the root abnormality in cancer cells. Root abnormality. It is Virchow's former assistant David Paul von Hansermann, following Fleming's and Virchow's trails, who made the logical leap between the two. Examining cancer cells stained with aniline dyes with a microscope, von Hansermann noticed that Fleming's chromosomes were markedly abnormal in cancer. The cells had split, frayed, disjointed chromosomes, chromosomes broken and rejoined, chromosomes in triplets and quadruplets. Von Hansermann's observation had a profound corollary. Most scientists continued to hunt for parasites in cancer cells. Bennett's theory of spontaneous separation still held a macabre fascination for some pathologists. But von Hansermann proposed that the real abnormality lay in the structure of these bodies internal to the cancer cell, in chromosomes, and thus in the cancer cell itself. But was it cause or effect? Had cancer altered the structure of chromosomes, or had chromosomal changes precipitated cancer? Von Hansermann had observed a correlation between chromosomal change and cancer. What he needed was an experiment to causally connect the two. But the missing experimental link emerged from the lab of Theodore Boveri, yet another former assistant of Virchow's. Like Fleming, who worked with salamander cells, Boveri chose to study simple cells in simple organisms, eggs from sea urchins, which he collected on the windswept beaches near Naples. Urchin eggs, like most eggs in the animal kingdom, are strictly monogamous. Once a single sperm has entered the egg puts up an instant barrier to prevent others from entering. After fertilization, the egg divides, giving rise to 2, then 4 cells, each time duplicating the chromosomes and splitting them equally between the two daughter cells. To understand this natural chromosomal separation, Boveri devised a highly unnatural experiment. Rather than allowing the urchin egg to be fertilized by just one sperm, he stripped the outer membrane of the egg with chemicals and forcibly fertilized the egg with 2 sperms. That is called a gangbang. I'm kidding. The multiple fertilization, Boveri found, precipitated chromosomal chaos. 2 sperms fertilizing an egg results in 3 of each chromosome, a number impossible to divide evenly. The urchin egg, unable to divide the number of chromosomes appropriately among its daughter cells, was thrown into frantic, eternal disarray. The rare cell that got the right combination of all 36 sea urchin chromosomes developed normally. Cells that got the wrong chromosome combinations failed to develop or aborted development and involuted and died. Chromosomes, Boveri concluded, must carry information vital for the proper development and growth of cells. You can see my speech is slurring. That's because my jaw is fucking numb and my muscles are sore. This conclusion allowed Boveri to make a bold if far-fetched conjecture about the core abnormality in cancer cells. Since cancer cells possessed striking aberrations in chromosomes, Boveri argued that these chromosomal abnormalities might be the cause of the pathological growth characteristic of cancer. Boveri found himself circling back to Galen, to the age-old notion that all cancers were connected by a common abnormality, the unitary cause of carcinoma, as Boveri called it. Cancer was not an unnatural group of different maladies, Boveri wrote. Instead, a common feature lurked behind all cancers, a uniform abnormality that emanated from abnormal chromosomes, and was therefore internal to the cancer cell. Boveri could not put his finger on the nature of this deeper internal abnormality, but the unitary cause of carcinoma lay in this disarray, not a chaos of black bile, but a chaos of blue chromosomes. Oh, man. I'm gonna shift positions again. I've been putting too much stress on my elbows. Boveri published his chromosomal theory of cancer in an elegant scientific pamphlet entitled Concerning the Origin of Malignant Tumors in 1914. It was a marvel of fact, fantasy, and inspired guesswork that stitched sea urchins and malignancy into the same fabric. But Boveri's theory ran into an unanticipated problem, a hard contradictory fact that it could not explain away. In 1910, 4 years before Boveri had published his theory, Peyton Roos, working on the Rockefeller Institute, had demonstrated that cancer in chickens could be caused by a virus, soon to be named the Rous sarcoma virus, or RSV. The central problem was this: as causal agents, Rous's virus and Boveri's chromosomes were incompatible. A virus is a pathogen, an external agent, an invader exogenous to the cell. A chromosome is an internal entity, an endogenous structure buried deep inside the cell. The two opposites could not both claim to be the unitary cause of the same disease. How could an internal structure, a chromosome, and an internal let me restart the sentence. How could an internal structure, a chromosome, and an external infectious agent, a virus, both create cancer? In the absence of concrete proof for either theory, a viral cause for cancer seemed far more attractive and believable. Viruses, initially isolated in 1898 as minuscule infectious microbes that cause plant diseases, were becoming increasingly recognized as causes for a variety of animal and human diseases. In 1909, a year before Roos isolated his cancer-causing virus, Karl Landsteiner implicated a virus as the cause for polio. By the early 1920s, viruses that caused cowpox and human herpes infections had been isolated and grown in laboratories, further cementing the connection between viruses and human and animal diseases. Undeniably, the belief in cause was admixed with the hope for a cure. If the causal agent was exogenous and infectious, then a cure for cancer seemed more likely. Vaccination with cowpox, as Jenner had shown, prevented the much more lethal smallpox infection, and Rousseau's discovery of a cancer-causing virus, albeit in chickens, had immediately provoked the idea of a therapeutic cancer vaccine. In contrast, Boveri's theory that cancer was caused by a mysterious problem lurking in the thread-like chromosomes stood on thin experimental evidence and offered no prospect for a cure. And that's another break. Man. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pages left. While the mechanistic understanding of the cancer cell remained suspended in limbo between viruses and chromosomes, a revolution in the understanding of normal cells was sweeping through biology in the early 20th century. The seeds of this revolution were planted by a retired nearsighted monk in an isolated abbey in Brno, Austria, who bred pea plants as a hobby. In the early 1860s, working alone, Gregor Mendel had identified a few characteristics in his purebred plants that were inherited from one generation to the next: the color of the pea flower, the texture of the pea seed, the height of the pea plant. When Mendel intercrossed short and tall, or white and violet flowers, plants using a pair of minute forceps, he stumbled on a startling phenomenon. Short plants bred with tall plants did not produce plants of intermediate height. They produced tall plants. Wrinkle-seeded peas crossed with smooth-seeded peas produced only wrinkled peas. The implication of Mendel's experiment was far-reaching. Inherited traits, Mendel proposed, are transmitted in discrete, individual packets. Biological organisms transplant instructions from one cell to its progeny by transferring these packets of information. Mendel could only visualize these traits or properties in the descriptive sense, as colors, textures, or heights, moving from generation to generation. He could not see or fathom what conveyed this information from one plant to another, to its children. His primitive lamp-lit microscope, with which he could barely peer into the interior of cells, had no power to reveal the mechanism of inheritance. Mendel did not even have the name for this unit of inheritance. Decades later, in 1909, botanists would christen it a gene. But the name was still just a name. It offered no further explanation about a gene's structure or function. Mendel's studies left a provocative question hanging over biology for nearly a century. In what corporeal, physical form was the gene, the particle of inheritance carried inside the cell? Oh, that is a break. Okay. Man, my jaw, dude. I am out of this game. My jaw, but I have to finish this chapter. In 1910, Thomas Hunt Morgan, an embryologist at Columbia University in New York, discovered the answer. Like Mendel, Morgan was a compulsive breeder. I wish I was a compulsive breeder, my god. But of fruit flies, ew, which he raised by the thousands on rotting bananas in the fly room on the far edge of the Columbia campus. Again, like Mendel, Morgan discovered heritable traits moving indivisibly through his fruit flies generation upon generation, eye colors and wing patterns that were conveyed from parents to offspring without blending. Morgan made another observation. He noted that an occasional rare trait, such as white eye color, was linked to the gender of the fly. White eyes were found only in male flies, but maleness, the inheritance of segs, Morgan knew, was linked to chromosomes. So genes had to be carried on chromosomes. The thread-like structures identified by Fleming 3 decades earlier. Indeed, a number of Fleming's initial observations on the properties of chromosomes began to make sense to Morgan. Chromosomes were duplicated during cell division, and genes were duplicated as well and thus transmitted from one cell to the next, and from one organism to the next. Chromosomal abnormalities precipitated abnormalities in growth and development of sea urchins, and so abnormal genes must have been responsible for this dysfunction. In 1915, Morgan proposed a crucial advance to Mendel's theory of inheritance. Genes were born on chromosomes. It was the transmission of chromosomes during cell division that allowed genes to move from a cell to its progeny. And another break. The third vision of this gene emerged from the work of Oswald Avery, a bacteriologist at the Rockefeller University in New York. Mendel had found that genes could move from one generation to the next. Morgan had proved that they did so by being carried on chromosomes. In 1926, Avery found that in certain species of bacteria, genes could also be transmitted laterally between two organisms, from one bacterium to its neighbor. Even dead inert bacteria, no more than a conglomeration of chemicals, could transmit genetic information to live bacteria. This implied that an inert chemical was responsible for carrying genes. Avery separated heat-killed bacteria into their chemical components, and by testing each chemical component for its capacity to transmit genes, Avery and his colleagues reported in 1944 that their genes were carried by one chemical, deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, which scientists had formerly disregarded as a form of cellular stuffing with no real function. A stupid molecule, as Max Delbruck once called it dismissively, turned out to be the central conveyor of genetic information between cells, the least stupid of all molecules in the chemical world. By the mid-1940s, 3 decades after biologists had coined the word, the molecular nature of the gene had come into focus. Functionally, a gene was a unit of inheritance that carried a biological trait from one cell to another or from one generation to the next. Physically, genes were carried within the cell in the form of chromosomes. Chemically, genes were composed of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. That's another break. My god. But the gene only carries information. The functional, physical, and chemical understanding of the gene begged the mechanistic understanding. How did genetic information become manifest within the cell? What did the gene do, and how? George Beadle, Thomas Morgan's student, switched from Morgan's fruit flies to an even more primitive organism, humans. I'm kidding. Bread mold, to answer these questions. Collaborating with the biochemist Edward Tatum at Stanford University in California, Beadle discovered that these genes carried instructions to build proteins, complex multidimensional macromolecules that were the workhorses of the cell. Proteins, researchers found in the 1940s, carry out the bulk of cellular functions. They form enzymes, catalysts that speed up biochemical reactions vital to the life of the cell. Proteins are receptors for other proteins and molecules, responsible for transmitting signals from one cell to the next. They can create structural components of the cell, such as the molecular scaffolding that allows the cell to exist in a particular configuration in space. They can regulate other proteins, thus creating minuscule circuits inside the cell, responsible for coordinating the life cycle of the cell. Beadle and Tatum found that the gene works by providing the blueprint to build a protein. A protein is a gene realized, the machine built from a gene's instructions. But proteins are not created directly out of genes. In the late 1950s, Jacques Monod and François Jacob, working in Paris, Sidney Brenner and Matthew Meselson at Caltech, and Francis Crick at Cambridge, discovered that the genesis of proteins from genes requires an intermediary step, a molecule called ribonucleic acid, or RNA. RNA is the working copy of the genetic blueprint. It is through RNA that a gene is translated into a protein. The intermediary RNA copy of a gene is called a gene's message. Genetic information is transmitted from a cell to its progeny through a series of discrete and coordinated steps. First, genes located in chromosomes are duplicated when the cell divides and are transmitted into progeny cells. Next, a gene in the form of DNA is converted into RNA copy. Finally, this RNA message is translated into a protein. The protein, the ultimate product of genetic information, carries out the function encoded by the gene. This unidirectional flow of genetic information, DNA, RNA, and then protein, was found to be universal in living organisms, from bacteria to slime molds to fruit flies to humans. In the mid-1950s, biologists termed it the central dogma of molecular biology. The central dogma of molecular biology. That's our last break, I believe. Yes, last break. And then we're free. We're totally free. An incandescent century of biological discovery, spanning from Mendel's discovery of genes in 1860 to Monod's identification of the RNA copy of genes in the late 1950s, illuminated the inner workings of a normal cell, but it did little to illuminate the workings of a cancer cell or the cause of cancer, except in two tantalizing instances. The first came from human studies. 19th century physicians had noted that some forms of cancer, such as breast and ovarian cancer, tend to run in families. This in itself could not prove a hereditary cause. Families share not just genes but also habits, viruses, foods, exposures to chemicals, and neurotic behaviors, all factors at some time or another implicated as causes of cancer. But occasionally, a family history was so striking that the hereditary cause, and by extension a genetic cause, could not be ignored. In 1872, Hilario de Gouveia, a Brazilian ophthalmologist practicing in Rio, treated a young boy with a rare cancer of the eye called a retinoblastoma by removing the eye surgically. The boy had survived, grown up, and married a woman with no family history of cancer. The couple had several children, and 2 of the daughters developed their father's retinoblastoma in both eyes and died. De Gouveia reported this case as a puzzling enigma. He did not possess the language of genetics, but to later observers, the case suggested an inherited factor that lived as genes and caused cancer. But such cases were so rare that it was hard to test this hypothesis experimentally, and de Gouveia's report was largely ignored. The second time scientists circled around the cause of cancer, almost hitting the nerve spot of carcinogenesis, came several decades later after the strange Brazilian case. In the 1910s, Thomas Hunt Morgan, the fruit fly geneticist at Columbia, noticed that mutant flies occasionally appeared within his flock of flies. In biology, mutants are determined as organisms that differ from the normal. Morgan noticed that an enormous flock of flies with normal wings might occasionally give birth to a monster with ruffed or scalloped wings. These mutations, Morgan discovered, were the result of alterations in genes, and the mutations could be caused from one generation to the next. Could be carried over, from one generation to the next. But what caused mutations? Oh my god, 116. In 1928, Hermann Joseph Muller, one of Morgan's students, discovered that X-rays could vastly increase the rate of mutation in fruit flies. At Columbia, Morgan had produced mutant fruit flies spontaneously. When DNA is copied during cell division, a copying error occasionally generates an accidental change in genes, thus causing mutations. Muller found that he could accelerate the incidence of these accidents. Using X-rays to bombard flies, he found that he could produce hundreds of mutant flies over a few months, more than Morgan and his colleagues had produced using their vast breeding program over nearly 2 decades. The link between X-rays and mutations nearly led Morgan and Muller to the brink of a crucial realization about cancer. Radiation was known to cause cancer. Recall Marie Curie's leukemia and the tongue cancers of the radium watchmakers. Since X-rays also cause mutations in fruit fly genes, could cancer be a disease of mutations? And since mutations were changes in genes, could genetic alterations be the unitary cause of cancer? Had Muller and Morgan, student and mentor, pitched their formidable scientific skills together, they might have answered this question and uncovered the essential link between mutations and malignancy. But once close colleagues, they became pitted and embittered rivals. Cantankerous and rigid with old age, Morgan refused to give Muller full recognition for his theory of mutagenesis, which he regarded as a largely derivative observation. Muller, in turn, was sensitive and paranoid. He felt that Morgan had stolen his ideas and taken an undue share of credit. In 1932, having moved his lab to Texas, Muller walked into the nearby woods and swallowed a roll of sleeping pills in an attempted suicide. He survived but was haunted by anxiety and depression, and his scientific productivity lapsed in his later years. Morgan, in turn, remained doggedly pessimistic about the relevance of the fruit fly work in understanding human diseases. In 1933, Morgan received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his far-reaching work on fruit fly genetics. Muller would receive the Nobel Prize independently in 1946. But Morgan wrote self-deprecatingly about the medical relevance of his work. The most important contribution to medicine that genetics has made is, in my opinion, intellectual. At some point far in the future, he imagined a convergence between medicine and genetics.
Possibly, he speculated, the doctor may then want to call in his geneticist friends for consultation. But to oncologists in the 1940s, such a consultation seemed far-fetched. The hunt for an internal genetic cause of cancer had stalled since Bovary. Pathological mitosis was visible in cancerous tissue, but both geneticists and embryologists failed to answer the key question. What caused mitosis to turn so abruptly from such an exquisitely regulated process to chaos? More deeply, what had failed was a kind of biological imagination. Bovary's mind had so acrobatically leapt from sea urchins to carcinomas, or Morgan's from pea plants to fruit flies, in part because biology itself was leaping from organism to organism, finding systematic cellular blueprints that ran deeply through the living world. But extending that same blueprint to human diseases had turned out to be a much more challenging task. At Columbia, Morgan had assembled a fair collection of fruit fly monsters, but none of that even remotely resembled a real human affliction. The notion that a cancer doctor might call in a genetic friend to help understand the pathophysiology of cancer seemed laughable. Cancer researchers would return to the language of genes and mutations again in the 1970s, but a journey back to this language and to the true unitary cause of cancer would take a bewildering detour towards the terrain of new biology and a further 50 years. And finally, I'm done. Not with this book, of course. I still have hundreds more pages. But I can finally go to sleep. There are 585 pages in total, and I need to read 236 pages in the span of 2.5 days. Fuck me. I need a whole bunch of water for tomorrow. Okay. I'm still miffed about how I water damaged my book, but it'll be fine.